Hello and welcome back to Making Better Bites. It's your host Adrienne here for another episode. Today we're specifically going to be talking about ovulation and why it's important for your body to ovulate and experience a full menstrual cycle. So I got this idea because last week on my Instagram stories, I had just randomly decided I just had a thought and I shared it, and my thought was regarding your fertility and how it feels like so often we are taught to fear our fertility because if you have any kind of problem, if you're concerned about getting pregnant, if you have any abnormality with your menstrual cycle health as a woman, you are often met with a solution, um, being that you should go on hormonal birth control. It's a solution for a lot of friends of mine, a lot of other women that I know of, and just experience that I've had overall is a big common experience that women have and have experienced for many, many years. And so, I mean, I wanted to talk on that, but I didn't want to just sit here and talk negatively about hormonal birth control or shutting down your menstrual cycle as a solution. So then I was thinking, how can I provide people with actual education and information and knowledge that would benefit them, and they would be able to use the information to help themselves and to improve their quality of life and to improve their menstrual cycle experience and maybe potentially begin embracing ovulation. And so I thought, kind of what goes along with fertility and what goes along with hormonal birth control and what goes along with these fears that we have. And I came to the conclusion that a good approach could be to discuss the importance of ovulating, and where ovulation plays a role in your menstrual cycle and in your health, and how you can better understand that and why it's healthy and important for a woman to ovulate. So I actually have a lot more notes with me here today because I had some quotes that I had pulled out from resources that I was looking at, and I'll be sure to link them in the show notes. So if you want to go back and look at any of the research or any of the articles that I was referencing in preparation for today's episode, you would be able to go back and do that. Other things you're going to find in the show notes are going to be a link to my weekly newsletter. So every Sunday morning, well, anytime Sunday, every Sunday I send out a newsletter that is in regards to nutrition and women's health and menstrual cycles. And oftentimes I discuss a nutrient and how your body uses it to support your hormone cycles, and your hormone levels, but potentially just nutrition as a woman in general and things that are important for females. And I kind of break it down on why it's an important nutrient, how your body uses it, and sources of ways you can find that nutrient in food, and then how you can use that in your day-to-day life. So that's kind of what the newsletter is all about. If you want to sign up, it just takes your email, and it's free every week to receive that email. So I really enjoy doing that. I think it's more fun than social media because it's something of my own. I can ensure that you guys receive the information every time, and I don't have to worry about it expiring or the algorithm not reaching people. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, you should definitely also check that out in the show notes. And then, of course, I'll connect my socials. I also am on TikTok and Instagram for various sharings of my life and my experience, and what I eat on a day-to-day basis, or recipes I'm cooking, or education things, just little tidbits of in between, if you want to connect more than just the weekly podcast. So yeah, I just want to put out that this is not any kind of health information or prescriptive for anyone. Just use this as general information. Please always remember that you should consult and work with your personal professional healthcare providers when it comes to making changes or decisions about your health. Me sitting here talking and providing you education, I don't know your health history, so they would be a better person to work with one-on-one. With all of those things out of the way, as always, let's go ahead and get into today's episode. So the first point that I wanted to bring up about ovulation and talking about why it's important is because like I said, I had a lot of quotes and things I pulled today, but the American College of Gynecologists had recently said at time that this article was written, which was September of 2021. So within the last 2 years, had recently to then said that your cycle could be considered your fifth vital sign, which I talk about all the time as well, that we need to be looking at a woman's menstrual cycle as something that is as important as her blood pressure, as important as her blood sugar levels, as important as like body fat percentages and cholesterol and hypertension and all of those different health conditions. And your dietary intake and your bowel movements and urinary output and all of those things, they're just as important as your menstrual cycle. Your menstrual cycle is indicating a lot of different things going on with your health overall. And it can be an indicator for any future potential health concerns as well, or tackling your menstrual cycle concerns from an early stage can be better preventative care and a better indicator for your future health than some other things. So I did also see something that said like that there has been an encouragement in the last maybe like 5 or so years for physicians to be interested and concerned for a young woman's early menstrual cycle experience. So discussing at those early appointments when girls first start getting their period and they start experiencing menstrual cycle. Of course, your ovulation isn't automatic right away. You have some anovulatory cycles as your body is adjusting to having a menstrual cycle. But it said like the first few years experience of your menstrual cycle can be a better indicator for how your future menstrual cycle experience or hormone experience will be in adulthood, better than your current hormones and how those are looking. So just being aware and discussing with girls from a younger age in their early on experience with their menstrual cycle and understanding like the phases of their cycle and what it is that they're experiencing can be really, really beneficial for long-term health. And of course, I assume that most people I'm talking to are not in the early years of their menstrual cycles. And so that's kind of a missed opportunity for us, but it does key in on the importance. If you have any family members or friends or children of your own who would then be experiencing a menstrual cycle, that you could get ahead of it early for them. And also the importance of learning it for yourself, no matter what stage of life that you are in, because your menstrual cycle can indicate for you a lot of different problems, because it all is kind of like tied in to other organs and like vital signs that are going on within your body. So what a healthy menstrual cycle should look like would be like 24 to 35 days in total length from first onset day of period till your next period would begin. But you're also going to be looking that you have healthy signs of ovulation, which we'll talk about in this episode as well, what those signs kind of look like, what healthy signs of ovulation are. And then also hoping for a luteal phase, which is your phase post-ovulation, all the way up until your next period starts. Typically that would be like at least 10 to 14 days long. I think 14 days was the average, so like 10 to 17 days. And you need that to be a healthy length as well, because you want to make sure that that can be an indicator of whether or not you're having healthy ovulation, because that luteal phase length is most often tied with progesterone levels, and that your progesterone is able to sustain your cycle long enough post ovulation before your next period begins. And having healthy progesterone levels ties in directly with having healthy ovulation, because of the process that after ovulation occurs, you have what is left behind in that follicle. So the follicle releases the egg, and then the follicle becomes what is called the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum is what will produce your body's hormones in that second phase of your cycle, or a majority of them at least. And so that is the estrogen, but most importantly, in the second half of your cycle, we're looking for those progesterone levels to be at a good number that is healthy and like peaking and then obviously dropping off. But you want to make sure that you're getting a prolonged enough rate, which would then be indicated by your luteal phase length most often. There are still times where you can unfortunately have a typical like menstrual cycle length and still have an anovulatory phase where you're not ovulating, but that's not super likely to happen, especially not regularly. And typically, if you have anovulation consistently, then you would, if you know the ovulation signs to look for, you would be able to often indicate that in tracking your cycle. So that's another reason why it can be beneficial to track your cycle, even if you're not experiencing abnormalities, because if you are experiencing anovulation, you'll catch those signs because you're not having signs of ovulation most often. Because there's often, I feel like a lot of people talk about the importance of tracking your cycle if you have abnormal menstrual cycles, which would be like out shorter than the 25 days or longer than the 35 days, typically, or if you're experiencing heavy periods or long period cycles, just long periods, like several days, longer than a week, then there would be more interest and more need for you to track your menstrual cycle. Also, along with like a desire to achieve a pregnancy or conceive a baby. If you are struggling with that or just wanting to get ahead of it, being able to track your cycles and know when you're ovulating can help you know when to attempt a conception through intercourse, obviously, or whatever. And so those are reasons typically people list off for why you should be tracking your menstrual cycle, but also it's important to know just so that you understand your body and you can, even if you typically have a normal cycle, you can be aware and look out for signs of abnormalities. That way you can just get on top of it sooner and get things fixed for yourself sooner. But yeah, so that's kind of one of the reasons, because your menstrual cycle is an incredibly important sign for your body that you are healthy or could be experiencing some health concerns. The second reason is because your ovulation is, or why your ovulation is important, is because your ovulation drives your cycle and your hormones, not your period. So oftentimes people think that the menstrual cycle is driven by your period, and the experience that you have with a menstrual cycle directly correlates to the experience that you have with your period, how much you're bleeding, how long you're bleeding, how heavily you're bleeding, whether or not you have menstrual cramps. And people think that all of those things are what is driving your cycle or driving the abnormalities in your cycle. But in reality, it's actually the action of having ovulation and whether or not you're ovulating that drives your hormone levels for your entirety of your cycle. So obviously, when you have your period, we refer to it as menstruation, and it is called the menstrual cycle. And we consider the beginning of the menstrual cycle to be the onset of the first day of your period. So I understand there's a lot of confusion because it's like, oh my gosh, everything about the naming, about the timing, about the counting, and everything is all surrounding our periods. So why would that period not be the most important thing? But our period is not what is driving your pain, your experience, the length of your cycle, your hormone production, none of that. So your period still is just as a result of an ovulation that has occurred without conception, without fertilization. So yeah, your period is actually not the medical driver of what is going on with your menstrual cycle, even though yeah, there's a lot of talk about it, which it is still incredibly important. Your period is important. It can be a big indicator for people that things are going abnormally, even if they're not a typical tracker of their cycle. Of course, the period is like a physical sign that is easy to follow and you can see it very well and you know what you're experiencing. So people can find abnormalities, even if it's just related to the period. But having a big picture of your menstrual cycle is going to give you a lot better chance and opportunity for you to be able to address the concerns and to make adjustments to improve your menstrual cycle, including your period experience. And ovulation doesn't always occur. Like you have anovulatory cycles, not like super regularly, but they can happen based on even in a healthy person with a healthy menstrual cycle and healthy body. Different things can happen in a month time that affects your cycle, and you might have an anovulatory cycle. So it doesn't always indicate a problem, but yeah, it's easier to miss, and people are aware of their periods. So I think that's why it's kind of like the beginning of your cycle is your period. I don't actually know, so maybe that's not right, but I think it's pretty obvious. Like if you're bleeding, that's pretty easy to pick up on. And I'm sure that this all began long before the science of understanding how a woman's body and ovulation and menstruating and all of that worked. So yeah, it's not the driver. Your ovulation is the driver. Like I said, previously, after you ovulate and the follicle releases the egg, that's what drives your progesterone levels. And then also the feedback from the progesterone levels having the peak and then the decline is kind of what drives the feedback then for your hormones to change again. So the estrogen is a little bit higher in the beginning of the phase of your menstrual cycle is when estrogen has its more important peak is in the first half. And also that drop in progesterone that was as a result of potential ovulation also is what encourages your body to release or shed your lining to make up your period. So that's kind of what drives all of those things. And then also then how healthy your estrogen is in the first half of your cycle is important for setting yourself up to ovulate again. So it all kind of is surrounding like ovulation. And I guess we'll go ahead and talk then now about signs of ovulating. So there's a lot of different things that people follow. The most common is going to be your basal body temperature or cervical mucus, or some people I think still keep track of like their cervical position and whether it is open or considered open or closed. Or maybe it's high or low. I can't remember how they talk about it, so I apologize. I don't know the verbiage. I'm not very familiar with like cervical positioning for being aware of your ovulation and where you are in your cycle, but I know that's one of the indicators as well. There's also people obviously use apps to track their cycle, or there's something called the rhythm method. I don't really know how it goes though, because I know it's not considered accurate because it doesn't take into account changes across all women, and then also changes across like a woman herself and how her cycle could vary. If you're using an app, it can be more accurate than the rhythm method, but you still need to be careful because of your own variations. So I know some apps try to predict your ovulation time simply based off of standards, like that most people ovulate in the middle of their cycle and everything occurs around like day 14, and then like your luteal phase lasts for so many days after that. But then some apps try to learn your period and menstrual cycle and menstrual cycle length and period cycle length to then kind of adjust where it's going to estimate your ovulation to be. But the best way to have an accurate tracking of your ovulation and your ovulatory health would be to go with an actual biomarker, which would be your cervical mucus and or your temperatures. So around the time of when you ovulate, your temperature is actually going to increase. Your basal body temperature, so your body's standard stable temperature, is actually going to increase by roughly around 0.5%, or yeah, 0.5%. So it'd be like 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So half a degree, sorry, not 0.5%. And then that will sustain itself throughout your luteal phase in order, and that would show that you ovulated, would be because you had an increase in the body temperature, and then it prolonged itself for a healthy luteal phase before your next period then began. And I think that's then when your temperature drops, is some point prior to your period or around the time of your period. And so that's a good indicator. But the thing with the body temperatures is that you have to take your temperature roughly the same time every morning, ideally, and then taking your temperature first thing in the morning with the same thermometer before you even get out of bed, because getting out of bed and like moving can cause like those same small changes in your body temperature. And so you might miss like when the actual rise in your temperature occurs. So it's best to be very particular about it. And that's why products now exist, like the temp drop, which I had a representative on, I think last fall, to talk about like the temp drop and how the temp drop works and like how basal body temperatures work. So if you're interested in more information on that, you can go listen to that episode. And also, I have a code. If you go through my Instagram, the link in my bio, there is a code for, I think, like 10% off or something if you use that code. So if that's something you're interested in, that's one option for tracking your ovulation. And then the second option for tracking your ovulation, or you can do in unison with, is, like I said, the cervical mucus method. This is the method that I was taught using, is your cervical mucus, because when around the time of ovulation, like I said, leading up to ovulation, you have higher levels of estrogen in your system, and that higher level of estrogen causes your body to change the texture and consistency of your cervical mucus, and that is in direct correlation with your body's desire to become pregnant. And so you need like that slippery, thin mucus to help with transport of sperm to the egg to create fertilization. And so that high estrogen cervical mucus is going to be, I think it said like 90 to 95% water, or maybe even higher than that, but it's mostly, a majority of it, it's mostly made of water. And so it has like a slippery texture. It becomes stretchy. Some people compare it to like an egg white consistency, and it's much thinner. And then when your estrogen drops or changes and your progesterone becomes your dominant hormone and has the peak, it creates a change in your cervical mucus, which causes it to dry up more. And so then you'll notice that change where you do not have that fertile type cervical mucus anymore. And so then you would know that most likely that your ovulation window has passed based on that. So one type of a cervical mucus method, the one that I use, is called Creighton method. And I also had a Creighton method practitioner on to talk about the Creighton method and what it is. So if you want to listen to that episode, that was also last fall, part of my fertility awareness method series. So those are two great resources if you're interested in learning how to use biomarkers that your body naturally gives you and signs to begin tracking your ovulation. Moving on to then the third reason that your ovulation is important is because the hormones and fluctuations involved in healthy ovulation affect multiple areas of your body as well as influence your long-term health. So this is where I really wanted to look at some of the studies behind like long-term health. So there was one article that I had read was by a naturopathic doctor. Her name was Laura, or maybe Lara Bryden, and she said physically or physiologically, women using hormonal birth control have altered brain structure, greater risk of depression, and autoimmune disease. And then that wasn't the most important one, though, that I wanted to share. Sorry. Oh, here. So this was from an endocrinology professor, which endocrinology is the study of your hormones. So an endocrinology professor was talking about women benefit from 35 to 40 years of ovulatory cycles to prevent things like osteoporosis, stroke, dementia, cardiovascular disease, and breast cancer. So 35 to 40 years of ovulatory cycles, that is really crazy to think about something like that. But yeah, so our hormones are really important because estrogen can play a role in influencing, like from month to month, your muscle gain, your insulin sensitivity. And then looking at long-term estrogen health it could have an influence on your bones, your brains, and your cardiovascular health. And then the other big hormone that we've been talking about is progesterone, which month to month can influence your inflammatory levels, your immune function, and your thyroid function. And then for the long term, can also have an effect on your brain, your bones, and your breast tissue as well. So those things are all like long term that you're going to be looking at for your health as a woman, and experiencing ovulation and experiencing those healthy like rises and falls in your hormones and your the cyclical way that estrogen and progesterone change, along with a lot of other hormones as well that I'm not going to get into today because it's way too detailed and it would not fit into like this kind of an episode. But just trust me on that. There's a lot of other hormones and hormone factors that are at play in this situation, but that they are all extremely important for your long-term health as well. And then also on one of the things that I was reading, they were talking about how like there's not any hormonal birth controls that are going to provide you with any progesterone. So it's by not having a cycle, you're not going to have the progesterone because like we've discussed, it's driven by your ovulation and the fact that you ovulate and you have the corpus luteum to release a majority of your progesterone. And also, I think a lot of hormonal birth controls are supplying you with estrogen to keep your levels specific depending on what the function of that specific hormonal birth control is. And so you're not having those like natural changes that your body would typically experience when regularly experiencing a complete menstrual cycle. So that can play an effect on a lot of your other processes and your mental health, your physical health, your long-term health, your short-term health. It's just really important to make sure that your body is ovulating and experiencing a healthy ovulation. Outside of hormonal birth control, other things too that I wanted to talk about briefly that could be affecting your ovulation, because ovulation plays a role in so many factors that so many other health factors can also then play a role in whether or not you're ovulating, is that it could be a hypothalamic issue, a pituitary issue, a thyroid issue, an adrenal issue, an ovarian issue, or a metabolic issue. So an example, I think it said that like the hypothalamic is the most common that you're going to find typically that's associated, and that can be affected by your exercise levels, your nutrition, your stress, or psychiatric problems such as experiencing anorexia. And also the other one that was involved with that was that hypercortisolemia, which would just be when you have elevated cortisol levels in your system, which is your stress hormone, which can be altered drastically by your sleep patterns, your awake patterns, how much stress you have physiologically, mentally, all of those things. Having too high of cortisol in your blood affects your what's called your GnRH and your gonadotropins, which, like I said, are just two of those other hormone factors that are involved with healthy ovulation that your body uses as signals to and from your brain to your reproductive system that play into whether or not you ovulate and what your ovulatory health looks like. And so having high cortisol blocks those two factors, which can then play a role in inhibiting whether or not you're going to have a healthy ovulation as well. So those things are all intertwined. And then also, because I had mentioned that the thyroid is associated with an ovulatory problem or an anovulatory cycle. And I know a lot of women suffer from thyroid issues, especially hypothyroidism. I know I used to have symptoms of hypothyroidism, which I also struggled with having a healthy ovulatory cycle, or I used to until I made all of these like lifestyle changes. Another thing from the same study that I was reading, that they were talking about menorrhagia, which is heavy, prolonged, painful bleeding with your period, is common with hypothyroidism. And the reason that it's so common with hypothyroidism is because it creates, having hypothyroidism creates a decrease in what's called your sex hormone binding globulin. So your sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG, it would be abbreviated, is associated with helping your body to bind estrogen. So if your hypothyroidism is creating a decrease in that binder, it would increase the amount of free estradiol, or like the estrogen that's just floating freely around in your blood, that promotes endometrial growth. So it would cause those heavy, painful periods because your body isn't able to bind the estrogen that you need in order to have a healthy cycle, which then causes a higher amount of growth in your endometrial lining, which would then create a heavy period and could create a very painful period, which I have been diagnosed with menorrhagia as well. So it makes sense that I was experiencing that when I was also experiencing a lot of those symptoms of hypothyroidism, and why I also had the estrogen and progesterone issues, because it was ovulation problems, and then there were problems probably with my free estradiol that were creating thickened endometrial growth, which is just so wild to me. Like, looking back at all of this information, like, I wish I knew this from the very beginning, which obviously I would have just had to innately know it, or like my doctors would have had to told me in some way at such a young age. But I just think it's so interesting that having those symptoms of hypothyroidism affects whether or not you can bind your estrogen, which then affects your body's ability to have healthy and not too much of an endometrial growth. So that's really fascinating. And if you've had any kind of experiences like I have had, and that's how you found yourself here, then you can totally relate in all of these things and how important they are. So yeah, one last thing that I wanted to throw out there is, if you are someone who keeps track of your menstrual cycle and you already know that you maybe are experiencing a menstrual cycle, or you're not sure if you're experiencing an abnormal menstrual cycle, and you want to know the signs to look for, or like you don't know when it is that you should contact your doctor, these were kind of the guidelines that they gave that I really trust from that same source that I was got a lot of really great information about the hormones on. So they gave their recommendation for reaching a doctor is, if you keep track of your menstrual cycles and you have 3 or more abnormal cycles in a 1-year time period, or if you have 2 cycles in a row back to back that are considered abnormal. If you experience either of those things, either 3 or more in a year's time period or 2 in a row, you should consult your specialist, like your OBGYN, and have a hormonal profile done. So that is a very low threshold that I don't think a lot of people are upholding, which is really crazy to me, because I would have thought you would have to have way more like abnormalities for longer than that for them to be like concerned. But it's just another reason why it's so important to keep track of your cycle, because like I said, you can get assistance and talk to your providers faster and sooner and be more aware of what's going on, and have like historical data on yourself on whether or not this is normal for you, what you're experiencing. And like I said, those things that are considered abnormal would be if you do not have, if your menstrual cycle in total is outside of the 24 to 36 day time frame, whether it's shorter or longer. If you are not experiencing a roughly 11 to 17 day luteal phase, so that would just matter if you're aware of your ovulation, because you'd have to know about when you ovulate. And then the number of days that follows before your period begins should fall around 11 to 17 days in order to be considered normal. And then if you're able to identify your ovulation from whether you're using like your basal body temperature or cervical mucus, if you have an anovulatory cycle, then that would also, of course, be considered abnormal. So all of those things being said, I know it's a lot of information. I feel like I was talking really fast, so but hopefully you got it all in. And yeah, it's why it's really important that we need to ovulate, and why we need to understand our ovulation health and not be afraid of ovulating and not being afraid of our fertility, because we can understand our fertility, we can understand our bodies, we can use all of those signs, all of those biomarkers, all of that information to be able to understand when it is that we're fertile, whether we want to. You can just use that information however works for you. And then also, but outside of fertility, all of these other health indicators, all of these other health complications and things that are in play that have to do with your menstrual cycle, whether directly linked to your fertility or not. There's just so many things involved. You're mentally, physically, all of the above. So it's just really, really, really important for you to understand your menstrual cycle, to have healthy ovulation, to experience all of these things cyclically as a woman who has a menstrual cycle. It's really healthy and important for short-term and long-term health. So I hope that this helps you to grasp a better understanding of it, and to know why I say things like, oh, why do we have to fear our fertility? It's so important to experience menstrual cycles and to not shut them down if we have the opportunity to work with our bodies and support ourselves better. So I hope that you guys enjoyed today's episode, and I hope that this has helped you to make better bites. Have a great week.